in his final year of high school, he was given a casual proposal from friend John Derrick to go to Europe for the ski season. Jim did not hesitate and immediately declared he would go with him. He had to shuffle to get the money, gear, and tickets, with a small matter of getting his parents' permission. Jim managed and all three and had a gift from Catherine White, who gave him $25 for a good meal when they got there. It was here that Jim got his first glimpse of the excitement and precision of what a small plane could do. He and David had left the gondola that took skiers to one of the many high calls leading out of the valley. He was startled when he heard the approach of a small plane. The pilot carefully flew into the far uphill slope until gravity stopped his forward movement. At that moment, the plane seemed to pirouette 180 degrees and pointed down from where he came from. At that moment, the people jumped out and with their ski gear, and once clear, the plane roared off down his old tracks and was airborne in seconds. The plane continued its drop until it leveled out over the village below. Jim was amazed and thought, what a challenge to perform such a feat. The image never left his head. John went on to see the Pope in Rome while Jim headed home. Once home, he went to work for his father in the trucking business, which was ever expanding. He had never truly thought about what his career was going to be. He was an average student, and though he made decent grades, he was not looking for indoor bookish work. He was content working for his dad, who had nevertheless urged him to get further education. He finally gave in, but could not suppress his spontaneous nature. And so this is what happened when Jim went to get his degree. When Jim returned from Europe, he put aside any thought of returning to school. His dad, however, appreciated the determination his own father had shown when it came to education, and was soon nagging Jim about finishing his schooling. So Jim headed for the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, or SAIT, in Calgary. He was at the registrar's office to pick up an application for an electronics certificate when two very pretty young women approached the next wicket. After they left, Jim asked the fellow behind the desk what they were applying for. He replied, commercial art. Jim looked at the man for a minute and then said, give me that form. He filled it out and trotted after the girls. He now reflects that if he had arrived half an hour later, he would have become an electrician. Jim was enjoying life and relishing its promise, but this was marred by a family tragedy in 1960 when his younger brother Tad died. When Ted was younger, he contracted German measles, from which he recovered, but it left him with a weak liver. It led to the condition later in life called Bright's disease. When Jim got to the hospital, the damage had spread to his other organs. Whatever pain medication they had given him, it seemed to have no effect, and Jim could barely watch his brother suffering. He was dead within the week. Tad had joined the Navy that year, but as his condition developed, he could barely work. Dismissing him as a malingerer, his insensitive superior sent him home with a dishonorable discharge. Just a second here. Tad had joined the Navy that year, but anyway, Bert was infuriated, and he fought to get the dismissal changed to a discharge due to medical reasons. When Jim was home on the weekends, he ran into his old friend Eddie Aman, who was now flying helicopter. Eddie encouraged him to come flying with him in his helicopter, then register for flight training in Calgary. Jim did both, and after taking a flight test with their pilot, he had no doubt what his career would be. Eddie and Jim bought a Piper Cub, and together Jim was able to earn a living while obtaining his license necessary to qualify to train as a helicopter pilot. And I think that's the plane, yes, it's quite a nice picture. He began his training with Bullock helicopters after he had his pilot's license. He obtained the license while earning his keep flying for the company. Jim was still working to obtain his fixed wings pilot's license when he met Hans Moser and Leo Grillmeyer. They had been guiding clients in the Rockies for some time. Hans was always looking for ski terrain that had yearly pristine powder snow for his clients and asked Jim to fly him to various locations for film shoots for his annual fall show in North America. Jim was happy to go on these extended trips as it gave him an opportunity to ski fine powder. Jim McConkie, a filmmaker and legendary skier, never passed up a chance to show his skills. Part of Jim's flying consisted of bringing supplies to the backcountry lodges, both winter and summer. He was a regular at Assiniboine Lodge where he met Siri Strom, Erling Strom's daughter. Erling was from Norway but had fallen in love with Assiniboine and was soon running the lodge. Jim was entranced with her beauty and lively personality, and before long they were married. In 1965, they had son Morgan, who would grow up in this environment. Siri frequently took Morgan to the lodge on horseback despite the weather. When Morgan was older, he became a good hand at bringing in the horses in the morning and going out with the guests on daily rides. Jim was a great father and took Morgan with him wherever he could. So Morgan was certainly familiar with helicopters at a pretty young age. By 1965, Hans had discovered the bugaboos and had moved into an old derelict sawmill building that they had made habitable. In the early years, the small underpowered helicopters had serious limitations and took a great deal of skill to fly safely over the mountains. Jim avoided one disaster with Hans while giving him a lesson on vertical reference. And this was Hans' introduction to bad weather. One incident gave Hans a clear insight into what pilots had to deal with all the time. It was a snowy socked-in day at the sawmill, and Hans, whose energy always needed an outlet, got restless and decided it might be a good time to check out the conditions on the slope leading down from Bugaboo Pass. He began bugging Jim about flying him up there so he could ski it solo to learn the terrain. Jim looked out the window and into the white wall of snow to see if he could even find the next helicopter, or even see if he could even find the helicopter. He told Hans the visibility was non-existent, making it impossible to establish vertical reference with the ground. That did not deter Hans. He nagged Jim mercilessly, saying they could fly above the clouds, not thinking about how Jim was going to find his way back through the clouds to the camp. Jim always found it hard to say no to Hans, and before long, they were both strapped into the helicopter with packs and skis. Hans eager, Jim concerned. There was enough visibility to find the pass, but not enough to establish vertical reference. Hans looked out and said, "This is good, put me down here." Jim replied, "I can't land here, I can't see where the ground is." Hans said if he couldn't land, he didn't mind jumping out with his packs and skis. Jim looked at him for a minute and said, "Before you jump, you might want to throw your pack out." "No problem." Hans maneuvered his pack onto his lap and shoved it out the door. He said nothing as he watched the colorful pack fall 200 feet to the snowy pass below. Jim did not relate if much more was said, but he now had virtual reference and was able to put hands down on the pass. As hands skied off, Jim wondered if his friend was a bit more aware of the consequences of not having well-marked landing sites established, a procedure that would become a priority not long after. But crashes do happen, and for the best pilots, especially in the early days of helicopter development. And Jim wasn't immune to these early problems. On one occasion, Jim was flying out to Briscoe to pick up 2 snow machines for their operation at the sawmill camp. He was about 2/3 of the way out when he had an engine failure. There was a little he could do but auto-rotate into the forest below. Fortunately, the trees were small due to recent logging, and he settled into the cushiony embrace with no damage to the machine or himself. He did not have radio contact, meaning he had to either stay put until someone came looking for him or make his own way out. He knew how difficult it was to spot a downed aircraft in the trees, especially if the rescuers didn't know his flight path, so he opted to walk out. Plunging through the snow over debris left from the logging was quite a challenge, but Jim finally succeeded in making it to a small logging road on the north side of Bugaboo Creek. At least the road was easier walking. He was discouraged by the lack of any sign the road was used, but there was nothing he could do but plod on. To his surprise, a truck appeared behind him, driven by 2 elderly ladies. They stopped, but seemed very wary of who he was or how he got there. They definitely looked as if they'd spent most of their life in the bush, probably in a small cabin further up the creek. They looked him over when he asked for a ride, and he wondered if they would believe him if he tried to explain the helicopter situation. With great skepticism, they told him he could ride in the back with a dog. He had just walked 11 miles and nodded gratefully and jumped in with the dog. The dog growled at him all the way to Briscoe. Jim's work with hounds was only 3 or 4 months in the winter, which gave him the summers to fly for Bullock helicopters in the north. This was mainly with geologists scouring the north for rich mineral finds. Most jobs kept him away from his family for months on end, and he missed much of Morgan's early years. It could also be dangerous, as the many early helicopter crashes attested to. Jim had a serious scare when he was flying for Canada's Centennial climb in the Yukon, for which they'd hired 2 pilots. The mountains and endless crevasse-strewn glaciers were a daunting sight for most of the climbers who had never been north. It was way bigger than anything they had ever seen, with serious technical problems. Jim took it all in, maintaining a cool reserve that helped immensely on one particular flight over one of the larger glaciers. And they say the pilots always flew in tandem, so there was one behind him. So what happened on that? Okay. On one occasion, having flown most of the way over a very broken glacier, Jim reported to Derek, "I don't have any oil pressure." Derek replied, "I know, the back of your engine's on fire." And it was. A hot bearing had come loose from the turbo engine and come in contact with the oil, which ignited. Given the terrain, he could not have landed. Jim could have dropped the valuable load of cargo, but he decided against that and carried on, hoping for the best, a calculated risk. With some degree of pride and relief, he says, "And I made it." He got out, put the fire out, replaced the turbocharger, topped up the lost oil. Then he returned to his flying mission. With all the excitement in camp and the dangers many of the climbers were experiencing daily, some would probably have been surprised to hear Jim even had a problem at all. This is a picture here of Mount Lucania, and he accomplished one thing that he's very proud of. With the permission of his passengers, Hans and Judy Cook, Jim landed on top of Mount Lucania at 5,226 meters, the third highest in Canada, the third highest mountain in Canada. It was a spectacular day, and the view was beautiful, showing the whole mountain range, almost like infinity. Jim's constant absence was hard on his marriage, as it must have been for Siri as well. The separation and ultimate divorce was painful for Jim, but he handled it in typical Jim way. He announced his divorce, then went to New Zealand. They were desperately looking for helicopter pilots that could do long-line slinging. So far, they were hiring kamikaze pilots returning from Vietnam and had a hard time adjusting to normal life. They flew like they were still fighting at the cost of many helicopter crashes. At this point, Jim had done some long lining, but here he really developed his skill for the work entails slinging net loads of dead deer that the hunters were shooting. With no predators on the island, the deer were overrunning the place and causing a great deal of damage. It was a bit of a depressing job, but Jim understood it was necessary, and he knew the meat was being used. The boys had limited opportunity to leave the isolated camp, but Jim still managed to juggle two relationships, finding the girls of New Zealand quite attractive. Jim returned that winter to work for Hans as he promised. In his absence, Hans had built a new lodge, and Bullock supplied more powerful machines to carry bigger loads faster and farther. Jim stayed with Hans until he was hunted down by Peter Furman, the Banff Park alpine specialist. Jim had flown with Peter on a few avalanche bombing missions, and they were well acquainted. Still, Jim was still stunned when Peter asked him if he would fly rescue personnel to rescues via a long line attached beneath the helicopter. This concept was one he had never considered and immediately said no, but added he would think about it. Jim had already been to Europe, chasing down an article Bruno Engler had handed him over the backyard fence about doing exactly that in Switzerland. Peter took his vacation there and visited the rescue center. He returned home with a knotted sling rope, prepared to hook it to anything solid under the helicopter. Before going further, both Jim and the Jasper alpine specialist Willie Pfister went to Europe with Peter to see the operation for themselves. By then, Jim had welded two strong phalanges. Peter did not waste time waiting for the permission from the park or the Department of Transport to try out some practice sessions with the wardens. Their reaction was one of horror. By then, Jim had welded two strong phalanges under the belly of the helicopter with holes big enough to accept the rescue carabiners. Despite the many glitches that had to be ironed out, the first warden school was held on Mount Rundle. During this period, Peter had a perfect rescue to prove his point to the park administration, and this was the rescue on Mount Edith. And here is the rescue on Mount Edith. A person would not know the real importance of this rescue from looking at Jim's logbook. Jim wrote, "Pickup at compound, rescue of injured climber on Mount Edith 7,400 feet, using vertical sling from Mount Edith to hospital on injured man and Peter." In fact, it was a dazzling success as they flew right over the Banff town site and the warden compound directly to the hospital. The rescue was not quite as simple as Jim's terse writing implied. A corporal in the Canadian Army was hit on the head by rockfall while participating in a training climb on the east face of Mount Edith, just north of Banff town site. The flimsy helmet liner the man wore was insufficient to prevent a serious indentation in his skull, leaving him unconscious but alive. The leader climbed down and alerted the RCMP by radio, giving them the details of the accident, which they immediately passed on to Peter. When Peter was given the information, he called Jim Davies to sling him to the site. When Jim approached the location, he realized he would have to do some fancy flying to get Peter on site. The steepness of the ground did not allow Jim to get close to the injured man for fear of hitting the rotor blades on the cliff face. To get Peter to the stranded party, Jim was forced to rock the machine, setting up a pendulum motion on the long line that enabled him to swing Peter close to the face. After a couple of tries, one of the Army members sitting with the victim pulled him in and attached him to the anchor they had set up. It may have been at this moment that Jim became aware of the implicit trust he would have in the men he would work with. For a short time, Peter was simultaneously clipped to the belly of the helicopter and the mountain when he secured himself to the piton anchor. Unlike slinging an inert load that could be released, this situation meant Jim had no control over this phase of the rescue. He was helpless to abandon the site, no matter what eventuality arose, until the rescue released him from the line. At that moment, a long, thin line of trust quivered in the air, establishing a silent dialogue between the rescuer and the pilot. No one could dispute the use of the helicopter, as it literally saved the man's life. The park and managers and regional office set out on a campaign to get permission from DOT, or Department of Transport, to rubber stamp the method. When DOT agreed to the program, Jim offered to fly solely for the park and be available for rescues within 15 minutes notification. He even had a fireman's pole in his house to get him to the door faster. Jim's main problem was how to establish vertical reference for the person below him. In this picture, you can see Jim looking out the window. He could see where the machine was in relation to the ground, but he had to look out the window to see the rescuer. He eventually had a bubble put in his window so that he could look out without the wind's distraction. In 1969, Jim was taking a break from the bugaboos and happened to go to a 3-day party at Warden Joe Hall Stenson's house in Lake Louise. It was there he met Sue Corliss, a young woman from down east who was working at the White Museum. He claims he actually met her when he and Morgan donated a muskox skull he had found in the Arctic. But one thing was for sure, by the time the party was over, they were an item. When Parks had finally received permission from DOT for flying rescues, Jim got an MOU an agreement with the Parks for the job. He had the regular maintenance jobs he felt would have enough flying time to warrant buying a helicopter. He formed his own company called Intermountain Helicopters. During most of the 70s, the number of rescues escalated alarmingly with both novice and experienced climbers. The wardens were scrambling to catch up. Jim was also becoming very skilled at getting into places that were challenging and got annoyed if the wardens were slow or inefficient. Cliff White remembers this clearly. And here's Cliff's relation with Jim, which is pretty good, actually. Cliff White remembers very clearly Jim warning him about the carabiner attaching his sling harness to the rescue ring. The carabiner was large and equipped with a protective sleeve that could be screwed down over the open end of the gate. He had been told not to screw it down while slinging on a rescue, but on this occasion, Cliff noticed the gate on the carabiner was open, leaving the carabiner seeming no safer than a metal hook. This made Cliff uneasy, so he decided to screw down the sleeve just enough to keep it from opening. When he landed, Jim saw Cliff struggling to release the carabiner. He finally got it off, only to see Jim approaching him fuming. Jim did not like having to hover in one spot where the winds could be unpredictable, making it dangerous to stay those extra minutes. Cliff acknowledged this, But the next time he had to sling under the helicopter, he did it again, thinking they were going to land in a safe place, and he had all the time he needed. Again, he struggled to release the bound sleeve, and again he saw Jim heading in his direction. All Jim did was look at Cliff and say, "That's twice." Cliff was cured, unwilling to find out what his fate would be if he were a third offense. He decided to take his chances with the carabiner rather than with Jim. Jim had reason to be concerned. These were minor things, but even the smallest mistake could cause a disaster. Jim didn't often tether to the mountains when the wardens were establishing a belay stance to get to the victim. Getting off could be even trickier. Jim was also called in if animals had to be transported. One memorable incident happened when he had to take a tame cougar to a film set. The owner, Mickey Bailey, ran the animal zoo out by Exshaw, whose animals were frequently used in films. On this occasion, the owner was in the back seat of the helicopter with the cougar crouched beside him. All was well until Jim turned on the rotors. Suddenly, the cat jumped up terrified and attacked the back of Jim's seat with claws and teeth while letting out a screeching howl. Bailey used all his strength to pull the cougar back with the choke collar. They were both ejected unceremoniously and told to find another way to transport the cougar. Search and rescue dogs trained by the wardens often had to be transported in the cab of the helicopter. This was reconsidered after one of the more aggressive search and rescue dogs almost took Jim's ear off. It was Earl Schonsberg's dog, Farrell, who had a bad reputation for biting anyone close to him. They soon had to reevaluate the dog's temperament and began training them to sling under the helicopter. Bears could also be a serious problem, even though they were slung below the machine in a cargo net. One of his first flights with a large aggressive bear resulted in tragedy when the biologist and filmmaker were brought along to further their studies on grizzly bears. The bear came out of the tranquilizer drug after it was released and turned on his tormentor, the lead biologist. On a more rewarding note, Jim was recruited to fly a grizzly bear to the backcountry when it was seen too often in the Banff town site and the campgrounds. And this is Jim's word from the books. The location to which they flew the bear was a high meadow at the head of Roaring Creek, which runs into the Red Deer River. It was early June, and the meadows were laced with old snowdrifts. A small snow-covered creek drained into the meadow and ran close to where the bear was released. When Jim deposited the bear on the ground, Bill and Monty rolled him out of the net and then hopped back in the helicopter, waiting for the animal to wake up. The bear slowly woke up, but lay there for about 10 minutes, which was normal. When the bear tried groggily to move, the helicopter was behind it. The only escape lay ahead across the creek, where it could reach the cover of stunted spruce trees on the other side. The bear ambled in that direction, but while crossing the creek, its substantial weight broke the ice. As it was still drugged, it did not have the strength or coordination to fight the current, and it dropped into the water, completely submerged. Jim looked at his companions, wondering if they realized the bear was going to drown without help. Neither of the men did anything to help the animal, however. Finally, Jim jumped out and ran over to the bear and hauled its head out of the water. The creek was surprisingly deep, but Jim was able to hold its head up until the bear became mobile. Once the bear could breathe, it bolted for the far bank and lay down, crossing its paws in front of it to support its head, and looked straight at Jim. Jim watched the bear walk slowly to the trees, glancing back once at Jim. It may be anthropomorphic, but Jim swears the bear was saying thank you. Just before Jim got into the helicopter, the bear once again laid down, looking up at Jim. This time, Jim swore it was saying thanks. There were a few words exchanged in the helicopter. Jim couldn't understand why neither of the two wardens had come to help. Jim had his camera with him and photographed the bear from the air to capture the moment. noting that at no time did the bear become aggressive. It was one of the most rewarding rescues Jim had flown in all his years of flying. We're going to go head right on to another episode with the next bear you see from Mickey Bailey's farm. Another more comical incident involving a bear occurred east of the park. And but one spring, the wind had brought down a number of large trees. One fell across the fence where Mickey Bailey's tame bear was kept. The bear, being no fool, took the opening of the closure as an opportunity to visit the outside world. Ed Carlton, who became involved with the effort to return the bear intact to the farm, told the story best. He sent the following letter to the editor of the then Banff newsletter. I evidently touched a tender nerve with my remark on the garbage content in the newsletter produced by the editor. So please accept this sincere disclaimer of any intention to wound or hurt the feelings of any person. To remedy this shocking state of affairs, I would like to relate an episode which involved our wardens, Jack and Perry. On Monday, a distress call came through to the wardens in the compound from Mickey Bailey, the game farmer and entrepreneur, to borrow some Cernalin, a serum used in immobilizing wildlife, evidently knowing our reputation for expertise in this field. Unfortunately, we are not considered adult enough to have this potentially dangerous drug on hand. So our two wardens raced the clock to Kootenai Park, where they met Warden Terry Gibson on the Vermilion Pass and took over the custody of the laborious handing over ceremony. Terry actually wanted to hear all the news about the big park. Before torpedoing back to the heliport, leaping into Hawkeye Jim's Davies helicopter, and ferrying out to the Bow River below the game farm. The reason for this mad dash: a day earlier, Muncho, a 750-pound Kodiak bear of ponderous gentility, had escaped through the wire to freedom and wandered east to the timbered slopes of Mount Yamneska, encountering two elderly maiden ladies who, after a slight pause to exchange amenities, he promptly treed. News of the disaster put Bailey and his helpers hot on the trail, and they coaxed Muncho back towards the preserve using an apple as a decoy. Once again, fate played her hand, and just as he reached the wire, a motorist, to exercise his 4 dogs, released them from his car. Muncho split the scene right now. Towards dusk, 2 anglers, intent on their task of catching the fishy denizens below in the Bow River, when one, threading his line through the eyelet, felt a strong tug on the lure and swung around in horror at a huge brown bear. A wild screaming look, and 2 fishermen like Eliza never touched the water as they crossed the wide Bow River. Again, Bailey used the old apple trick, while Muncho ambled along toward home until it reached the railroad track. A locomotive whistled around the bend, and the Kodiak was out and away. This big brown bear at large was shot with 10 cc's of Cernalin finally, which was more than enough for a fatal dose, but it kept him down for at least 7 minutes. His huge inert form was man-powered out of the bush and into the open helicopter cargo net, and then up and away with a spotlight beaming ahead into the darkness. Then Muncho ended up in the waiting maw of his pen within the wire. Mission accomplished, and with this spotlight peering ahead on a starlit night, the helicopter and our dauntless wardens returned to Banff. And I must admit, with such literary genius as above, I can understand why the aforementioned regarding newsletter content was made. I feel the only solution is now to bow out and fold my tent and silently steal away. So that was Ed's view of that particular incident. Not only was Jim responsible for the lives of animals, and he was also responsible for the people he flew during rescues and reacted quickly to people in trouble. and he also had time for his friends. He flew Bruce McTrow and Cheryl with the wedding party to be married in a high alpine meadow behind Mount Elmore. Later, when Marg Moser was having severe knee problems that had ended up in her ending her hiking, Jim realized how down she was, and on a beautiful sunny day, he took her on a flight over the mountains while doing some remote maintenance checks around Banff and Yoho. By 1983, Jim was happy with a regular life with Sue at home and doing the job he loved best. The wardens in public safety were becoming very professional, and they worked with Jim like a well-oiled machine. Jim had worked with Tim Odgers since 1972, and after Tim had moved to Banff in 1974, they became very good friends. Both had an intuitive understanding of how to work together on a rescue. During the time, Jim sold his company to Okanagan Helicopters, which gave him more flying time and less office time. Helicopters were becoming very expensive, especially the maintenance. Throughout the time, Jim had the sole contract for Banff. Other helicopter companies were popping up everywhere and gaining experience and confidence. It was not long before they looked at the lucrative contract Jim had and began to complain to Ottawa that they should have a chance to bid on it. At first, it was an annoyance that Peter kept fending off, seeing they had no pilots that could do what Jim was doing. When Ottawa began to question this, Peter and Jim and Tim decided to set up a test scenario for the new pilots for sling rescue skills. This thwarted the competition for a while, but inevitably Jim Stone came along from Quasar Helicopters and could do everything with ease. They finally had to open up the contract to outside companies to bid on. Jim warned Okanagan what to bid, but by that time they had expanded to being the dominant helicopter company in the world, and they were losing interest in Banff. As a result, Quasar underbid them by $10 an hour. Jim was shocked by the outcome and justifiably very disappointed in Okanagan. Nothing was sacred in the face of big corporations who put no value on the individuals and opted for big-time jobs up north. Ottawa was of no help due to the complete ignorance of the dangers of heli rescues. It took a while for Jim to reconcile to the new situation. He still worked for Okanagan, but their only base close to Banff was in Golden. Jim did this for a while until he was sick and tired of driving to Golden every day. But things were happening in Canmore. Lance Cooper, a former public safety warden in Banff, had always wanted to fly helicopters. Jim was generous in mentoring him through his training. He did not want to leave his home in Canmore, however, and decided to form a company there with two other partners. It was called Canmore Helicopters. The partners soon pulled out, and Lance sold the company to Alpine Helicopters. Alpine specialized in heli tours, backcountry lodges, and rescues. Since the inception of the Peter Lougheed Provincial Park, the Canmore Rangers were doing rescues for anything east of Banff. Lloyd Gallagher ran the program with a large task of training the Rangers how to climb. Lance and Jim soon came to an agreement to have Jim fly for them. It was a great opportunity as Jim had to drive only had to drive to Canmore and work with people he had known and trusted for many years. The warden and Rangers often trained together, and soon Jim's life was running much as it had before. In 1990, Sue came down with a rare autoimmune disease called scleroderma. That's when the body makes too much protein, collagen. She could no longer actually handle the cold. The doctor said the only long-term solution was to move to a warmer place. Neither wanted to leave Canada, so they checked out Vancouver Island. They found a beautiful house on Saanich Bay that seemed tailored for them. The deck was warm all year round, and they had plenty of friends nearby. Jim also got to see a lot more of Morgan, who was going to university in Vancouver to get a degree in sports education. Jim also made friends with a wealthy man from the U.S. who had a helicopter. He could not fly. It was not long before Jim qualified to fly in BC and began teaching Dave Fries how to fly his helicopter. They had one memorable 2-week trip to northern BC and Alaska. It's probably one of the few times Jim flew just to see the country. Their time on the coast was relaxing for both, and Jim soon returned to his art. But they both missed Banff, so when Sue's scleroderma cleared up in 1997, they returned to Banff. She picked up with her old hiking group of women and were soon putting on outrageous parties after long hikes or ski outings. In 2001, Siri died in Caslo at the age of 61, but Morgan kept her ashes until he could get to Assiniboine to scatter them. By then, Morgan had graduated and had a family with his partner, Marie. They presently have one son, Nico, who they are raising in the small town of Proctor on Kootenay Lake. Jim and Sue were nicely melding into the Banff community like they'd never been away. Unexpectedly, after they'd been home for 3 years, they went hiking on the Skyline Trail, in Yoho, where Sue said she wasn't feeling too well. She immediately went to her doctor and found out she had leukemia. She started radiation and chemotherapy once the diagnosis was clarified. This slowed the progression of the disease and she went into remission. Both hoped she'd defeated the cancer, but it returned 3 years later. By then, it had metastasized through her body and it was too invasive to respond to treatment. She died in 2006 at the age of 61. Her ashes were spread at Sunshine, where she loved to ski. Some went to Assiniboine, her favorite place in the mountains, and the rest fertilized a Norfolk pine growing in Jim's backyard. Though Jim had lots of support and endless meals dropped at his door, it took time and their help to live with the new normal. It was 5 years before he could clean out her closet. He soon returned to his love of painting and his production, and he produced a gallery of fine watercolors. Time and life have a way of tempering the past while forcing you to concentrate on the present. The stories became a bit muddled over time, but never really fade. Throughout his years of flying, Jim has received many awards that testify to his flying excellence. He received the Helicopter Association International Pilot Safety Award of Excellence in 1971, the Robert E. Trimble Memorial Award given annually for distinguished performance in the helicopter mountain flying, 1975, the Alberta Achievement Award, 1981, and the Summit of Excellence in 1988. Jim has left a legacy involving 2 major industries, but it is his rescue capabilities that he is most remembered for. It has given Canada top recognition with rescue services throughout the world. And now we'll see a few of Jim's paintings. Thanks, everybody. Okay, that's the end of our presentation. Dale, you have more pictures there? Okay, thank you everybody for donating your time and attention to this, and I'll turn it back